The aim of this event is to honor the work of Thor Heyerdahl and his ideas, his values, and the struggle for protection of the global environment. In his mind, there were no borders between people, and especially when it comes to the challenges we face when thinking of the environment. We have to work together to solve them. And it's high time to introduce to you the honorable guest here today, Professor Elinor Ostrom. And a short version here is that she is the professor at the Indiana University, at the Arizona State University, and she received the Alfred Nobel Prize in Economic Science in 2009. And she was the first, and so far the only woman out of 67 persons who have got this prize. Today, she's going to speak about a polycentric approach to climate change. And Professor Ostrom, I would like to invite you up.
So again, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here. And I'm going to follow in the tradition of challenging a few ideas and stressing the importance that we can do a variety of things that some people are presuming we couldn't do. So my basic concern is, do we have to wait for global solutions to climate change issues? And I am very strongly concerned about climate change. But there are all sorts of debates about what we should do. We have a history where the United States didn't even sign the Kyoto in 1992, something that I find very offensive. But we have multiple arguments, even in the academic world, in terms of, do we do cap and trade, where we try to reduce overall emissions while letting the market work, to get the rights to smaller and smaller, while getting smaller and smaller quantity of greenhouse gases being emitted. Do we just tax greenhouse gas emissions across the board? How do we develop policies that don't reward those whose past emissions were very, very substantial and are the basic cause of the problem? So these are some of the debates going on at international level. These are very important debates. There are responsible proponents on all sides. So some of the debates are not just people who are into trying to make an argument because their best interest is one or another. They're really seriously engaged. And one might have a very reasonable foundation for backing one or another proposal. But others also have reasoned foundations, and this isn't an era where there's just clear-cut one best choice. So we have trade-offs in trying to think through which of the policies make the most sense and how to adopt them at a global level. And then working out the details of how that could be done if we ever got an agreement. But my sense is we need to move ahead. If we just sit, we have a phrase, twiddle one's thumbs. If we just twiddle thumbs and wait and think those guys have got to make the decision, I think we are going to increase the difficulty of actually doing something once decisions are made at that level. So we need global level actions. But there's still some substantial questions about how we can move ahead. But what I'm most concerned about is that waiting can make the problem worse. It's not just warming that we're concerned with. As greenhouse gases continue to be emitted, we have the very great risk of increased variability, extreme events, and we've been seeing in the last couple of years a very high increase in the number of extreme events occurring, oceans rising, loss of coastal zones. Right now, frankly, I would not want to live in either the coastal areas of Bangladesh or Netherlands. I've had long talks with my colleagues in the Netherlands, and they're doing all sorts of things trying to prepare, because as a lowland, they realize they're in great problems, but there's still major problems. Pacific Ocean islands, some of them are just going to be gone, and the challenge there is tremendous. So I think the questions that we will address today, there's several. First, is the conventional theory of collective action the best theory for analyzing how to reduce the threats of climate change? And this is the theory that people use. Nobody will cooperate because they can hold out while others cooperate, so we have to have the government resolve. Well, we don't have the government. We have an international regime that isn't very powerful. As that's interpreted by many scholars, those using fossil fuels will just continue to use them regardless. They would supposedly they need an external government coming in and telling them to reduce. But I will argue that partly of what we've seen in some of our studies in other kinds of common pool resources, that the theories of Gerhard Harden and Mansur Olson are not fully supported. They're supported when there's no communication and no discussion among people on a horizontal basis. And that's one thing we'll have to come back to in terms of how to enhance that. But right now, the literature has global treaties are the only way. And so that means that we sit around and wait, and it could be another 5 or 10 years, and what could happen in another 5 or 10 years without a reduction is a very substantial threat. And what we have to think about is that we face a risk function. This isn't one of these things where there's a particular function and then you hit a particular level and it goes up to danger. This is a problem in which we have, and the more greenhouse gases up there, the greater the risk of very major ecological harm. And we need to think about it as risk, increasing and decreasing risk. So then we face the question, are only global benefits generated from local efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or are there potential benefits that can be created locally from local action? Because right now, it's the whole way it's modeled is that when you drive in your car, you get a private benefit and you produce a global harm. And the presumption is that since there's the harm is all global, that and the individual benefit comes at the small scale, the individual level, that you just don't pay any attention to it. And I'm going to be arguing that we've modeled this incorrectly, and that it is possible that actions taken at less than global scale to reduce greenhouse gas emissions offer some benefits, at least at the local level, in terms of levels of adaptation. Okay, another set of questions. I have a bunch. Are large-scale governments usually better equipped to cope with collective action problems that are large-scale themselves? Do we know that? It is large-scale, but large-scale will do it. Another question. If multiple governments and private firms are involved, instead of just a single authority, does that produce leakages? Having multiple government units or government and private, multiple organizations, is that chaotic? And is having multiple units potentially counterproductive? And these are raised repeatedly and have to be addressed. The last question that I will then deal with is, might a polycentric approach be an improvement over relying exclusively on global climate approach to cope with, global approach to cope with global climate issues? So can we think about polycentricity as one way of potentially getting a better response? Okay, let me do a very quick overview of collective action theory. Many of you have heard me talk about this before. I'm not going to spend much time on it, but basically the current theory is when there are a group of individuals whose actions collectively lead to a bad, that they won't do anything about it themselves unless they are forced to by an external agency. Obviously, reducing use of energy is very costly for an individual, but and it does generate benefits for others. And the presumption is that some people will free ride on others. They'll gain benefits without cost. I mean, after all, I can just sit around and wait for everybody else to do this. And why should I have to pay the cost? It's the no one wants to be a sucker theory, and pay high costs and get very few benefits because no one else, everybody else free rides. So we may even pay higher costs in the future if we don't do anything, and we need to be thinking about it that way. But we also have to recognize that collective action theory is accepted as generating a prediction that no one will cooperate, and we have to ask, is this true? So the conventional view is that there is a global externality. It illustrates this whole problem that if corrective action isn't taken, that individuals and officials are led to use too much carbon-emitting energy. That's what leads to the basic recommendation that we must have global because we can't do anything local. Okay. Now, the empirical support for collective action theory is, as universal theory, is quite weak. We find that there are many local to regional problems that are solved without relying on external authorities that come in and force people to do things. What we are finding is that there are many, many studies that show context makes a difference. And so the context in which individuals are interacting can affect whether or not they do undertake forms of collective action. So, one thing that's essential, users must view that they have a stake in the future. That their future is affected by what they and others do. And when they do view that, they're more likely to participate and to monitor others. And we find for studies of forestry and water resources around the world that user monitoring turns out to be most effective and more effective than government ownership or private ownership or community ownership alone. And this is, and we've now, there are at least 6 major studies that have found this, and I feel very strong in indicating that this is a major finding that we must take into account. So we need to change our assumptions when we think about collective action, and then we have to think of scales of effects at multiple scales. It isn't just individual act, global result. We need to be thinking of individual actions, group actions, bigger actions, and many scales. So in terms of the collective action theory, I recommend we rely on behavioral theory, that individuals do not always seek short-term benefits for self. I'm not arguing that we have angels out there. That would be, going from devils to angels isn't exactly the right way to solve this problem. But individuals can learn that what they can do can make a difference, and that others may or may not be following recommendations, and when they find others are likely to follow, and that they can make a difference by following, they will. And so we're finding that that works for small to medium scale in a lot of settings, a very large number of settings. So some of the forests we're studying where users are monitoring are extremely large forests. So this isn't just a little private, small So we can think of many of the problems that people cope with have nested externalities at multiple scales. So if we think of a behavioral theory now, we can think about people who are rational. They don't have complete information, but they can learn, boundedly rational. They may learn norms. And for those of you who are parents, you spend a good deal of your life trying to get your kids to learn norms. When you're working with colleagues on a team, on a research team, you hope that your colleagues have norms and feel some obligation to contribute if you contribute. We have to solve these problems all the time. And the context then is what affects what norms work. So when you have a context with a lot of feedback so that you know who's involved, who does contribute, what they do, how they do it, etc., that can make a difference. And that is part of what we can look to as ways of making it easier for individuals to reduce emissions. So now let's think about the externalities generated at a global level when we go driving in our automobile or keep our house heated at an excessive level even when we're gone. There's a lot of benefits that can come back to the individual and to the family and to the community. So at the individual level, if you drive everywhere and never walk, never bike, never take anything but an automobile, you have certain benefits. Faster, you might have symphonies in the car that you can enjoy and all sorts of other benefits, but you are emitting greenhouse gases. But if you were to take walks a little bit more, ride a bike from time to time, and plan family visits so that you're not traveling as long in the car, then you have benefits to yourself and your family and benefits to the globe. So there are nested. Now, if you then work on, more exercise, the slimmer you can stay so you don't have health problems due with obesity. A family that doesn't pay any attention to the furnace and lets it stay on even when they're gone for 8 to 10, 15 hours during the day, and that furnace is going full scale, they are paying one heck of a lot of cost for using energy inefficiently. And there are very substantial savings in energy use at the household level, as well as reduction of greenhouse gases. If no changes are made, households will purchase some level of carbon-emitting gases annually for heating and transport. If the current theory is an appropriate incentive Y, external, they purchase less, X minus Y, which does reduce emissions. But if they accept some responsibility themselves for eliminating hidden costs to the family, they reduce carbon even more. We can think about it as Y plus. And how might this be done? Well, it turns out that use of heating in building is 40% of the primary energy supply in the US. I don't know here in Norway, but in the US, this is a very large proportion of the energy used. More than 70% of all generated electricity is primarily for heating, cooling, and lighting. About 20% of all energy used by buildings can be potentially saved by correcting faults. So 20%, you can cut down 20% of that by getting better insulation, by insulating around the windows. There are cracks, there are all sorts of problems that can be corrected. And people haven't paid much attention to it, but they can save very substantially. In 2009, Tom Dietz and Paul Stern and several others did a major article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. They then take on this question of what can households do, and they argue that households can bring down greenhouse gas emissions by 20% within at least 10 years if they adopt weatherization, so that you actually are putting insulation around the windows. Low flow shower heads, efficient water heaters. One of the things that they mentioned that just fascinates me, and I will mention it to you, that a very large number of people heat their water so hot that when they get in the shower, they have to turn cold water on like mad. Well, if you have to heat your water up to this level, and then when you shower, you can't stand it, so you turn on cold water, this is a very bad use of the heating of water. And most of your wash and dishwasher don't need the heat that it is set. So do check your water meter when you are at your own residence again, and see if you can't bring it down just a little bit, because just think about it. If everybody in this room did that, that's not going to solve it. But we're trying to reduce risk. And this is one of those kind of low-cost things of how to reduce risk without it really costing too much. Obviously, there are improved appliances. Front-loading washing machines reduce energy use and water use dramatically. Fuel-efficient vehicles, trying to set the thermostat so that when you leave, you give it, getting a thermostat in your house that has time on it makes a big difference. And those thermostats are not that expensive, and they are very efficient. Okay, now communities, that was back at household. Communities, there are strategies available. I'm going to use the Sacramento Municipal Utility District or Berkeley First as two examples. I am from California. It's nice to have California examples. Sacramento is a non-profit utility. And they were worried about energy levels going up, and that they might have to make a new plant. And they thought, we don't want all of that expense to go to a whole new plant and all of this. So they prepared a plan to try to save money for themselves and reduce greenhouse gas. They started to take a random sample of customers and rate them on their energy use compared with their neighbors. And so you got a bill that compared your household use with that of others in the area, and the more efficient and the less. And so the bill looked like this. You're looking at your efficient neighbors, all neighbors, and you. And the desire of people who, they started with a thing of having little faces, and it was a big smile when you were less than others, and a big when you were more like this guy. But it turned out that some of the people who had more use had big families, and they objected to the frown. So they dropped that. But they kept the basic reporting, and it's really, they haven't had to build a new plant. They've kept their utility use down to the point that they don't have to. So it really changed behavior. And it did better. Earlier, they were offering financial rebates for buying energy-saving appliances. And this, getting that kind of feedback to people, actually was more effective than giving them a financial incentive to buy better utilities. As I said, the frowns didn't work. But what they've been finding is that some people who are now doing well are actually promising to do even better. So that goes on. Okay, Berkeley First. This is a financial incentive for renewable and solar tech. What they're trying to do is make it easier for people to make very big investments. And we're starting, Vincent and I will have solar heat for our solar system for our heating starting next month. So I'll know a little bit more about. I have an estimate of the expense. It's non-trivial, but when you look at local savings and some of the tax benefits, I think it's important. But in Berkeley, they would tell somebody, okay, you get a very careful estimate. And you take it down to the city, and the city looks at what you've said that you want to invest in terms of better heating facilities, water facilities, etc. And if they consider it legit, and so it's audited, it's not just real cash, they will give a citizen a 20-year loan to pay for really major things up front at very low interest. So, and then what they do is when you have your property tax, you pay that loan every year, which makes it, you don't have to worry about when you do it, how you do it, etc. It's just very low cost. And it's a new program. The first chunk of funding was gone very fast. They've gone to a second and third program. So this is something a city is doing to try to enhance reduction of greenhouse gases at the city level. Another question that I posed early was, would large-scale policies always correct externalities well? And the answer is ambiguous. Sometimes, yes. The Montreal Protocol, many people point to it and say, oh, well, the Montreal, it's working, why don't we just do that for greenhouse gases? Well, Montreal Protocol had some very special features to it. They had just come through with a new way of making replacement for CFS. And of all things, you had DuPont. I had just made a new discovery of a way of producing it. And so one of the biggest manufacturers thought, gee, if we forbid using the other product and we have a replacement, how great. And there were only 5 or 6 big companies involved at all, and one of them very much supportive of it. Well, that you just can't use and point to Montreal and say, well, they did it there, why can't we do it for greenhouse gases? We're in an entirely different setting. If we look at the EU fishery policy, until very recently, any of the evaluations I've read of it have been very negative. And trying to do the same policy for the Baltic as for the Mediterranean didn't necessarily make very much sense. Now there are very great efforts to do a polycentric approach and have multiple policies within the EU rather than one across. And if you think about the collapse of cod on the East Coast, this happened when Newfoundland fishermen went to the government of Canada repeatedly and said, there's a threat, there's a threat, there's a threat, please. And the Canadian government said, no, you fishermen, you don't know anything. You're fine, you just keep fishing. 2 years later, it collapsed. And the fishermen have had to pay the cost. It's been a real disaster. And local communities harmed, but the official agency did not recognize the threat, didn't have and wouldn't take any action. So, besides the problem of one big, and will always act, no, but frequently can, people point to all sorts of problems if you have multiple actors, and there are things like leakage between locations. So you shift a project from location X to Y due to a climate effort in X, but since it's now shifted to Y, there's no overall reduction in emissions. In terms of RED and RED+, there are all sorts of questions about it. And there are people here who have studied it and are more knowledgeable than I am, but at least there are many people fearing that indigenous farmers may be forced to leave some areas or to move from indigenous forests to homogeneous forests. and emissions might or might not go down, but costs could go up substantially. And so it's one of these policies that's considered by many as being a very good panacea, but the criticisms are also very substantial. We can have market leakage. We can have price increases due to reduced supply. It can then lead to increased production of timber. And so, on the one hand, you've reduced coal usage, but on the other hand, you're burning more wood. So it isn't necessarily always productive. Well, there's still other problems with the polycentric approach that people have pointed out. You can have inconsistent policies. The policies that are adopted in one country or one region may be different enough from those in another that people perceive it as unfair and it's inconsistent. And if you had global, then they would all be consistent, supposedly. The problem of certification is very substantial, and one that, especially if there are multiple actors who are acting as if you go back to looking at Kyoto, the actions under it, where there have been programs funded. Two of my graduate students have just finished a paper. In fact, I sent it to Arl yesterday, where they went back and looked at a number of those actions. And they found that in some cases the data was very inadequate. In the early version of it, they quoted where they supposedly had people who had been out and interviewing officials. And in project document 2005, in Village X, there's a quote from what people in the village said. And in document 2006, from another village, there's a quote from what the villagers told them. It's an identical quote. Some of that whole effort has turned out to be a way that various consultants have made a lot of money. But we don't have too much rigorous data about anything else. So there are a lot of problems when we go out there. So what kind of lessons do we carry? One, there are a lot of causes of climate change. This isn't just one single cause. There is then a challenge that we face of how do we get better knowledge about the multiplicity of causes and the effects in a world that's constantly changing. And this is a big challenge. A wide diversity of policies can lead to reduced emissions, but if there's a diversity, we might have opportunistic behavior by some to get a flow of funds by appearing to reduce emissions while not really having a real impact. And so, as I said, as people have evaluated some of the action items taken under Kyoto, they have found just a lot of corruption and, in some cases, no real impact. And what we should understand is that all policies adopted at any scale can generate errors. But if we don't have some trial and error aspects, so that you experiment with them, learn, change, experiment, change, learning, then you can have errors that get generated and don't get corrected. So why does the polycentric approach help us deal with that? Well, we started with a concept of polycentricity dealing with large-scale metropolitan areas. And the charge was made in the 50s and 60s that all metropolitan areas that had multiplicity of units, polycentric units, were chaotic. And in the United States and in parts of Western Europe, there was an effort to consolidate and get rid of all those small-scale units because they were inefficient. Ostrom, Thiebaud, and Warren did a very important theoretical piece back in 1961 to look at provision as one form of governance, so deciding what we want to have, and production as being something else. And the unit that provided chose what to produce for the community, didn't have to be the unit that produced. And they used the Lakewood Plan as an example of an effort to be able to separate out provision from production and how that could be much more efficient. Then we did a whole series of studies, including urban policing in 80 metropolitan areas. What we found was that smaller agencies were much more effective to deal with immediate response. So you call the police, and if you had a local police department, they would be likely to be there in 8, 10, 12 minutes. And when we did surveys of satisfaction with service, the satisfaction of small communities living in small communities was very high. On the other hand, many of the 80 had themselves figured out that crime lab wasn't something they should all do, and had moved it up to a single large unit. And there are economies of scale for crime lab and for dispatching. But many of people out there had already worked it out because they had a polycentric system. But then when you eliminate and get only unicentric, the overall efficiency and productivity goes down. We've been doing a large amount of work on forestry with centers in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And we go in and do very intensive measures of the biophysical as well as social economic over time. And obviously improving forest conditions is very important for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and for the reduction of climate change threats. We did a statistical analysis early, and we've done it time after time just to check ourselves. We find no simple correlation between government-protected forests, other kinds of government forests, private forests, and community forests. There is no statistical relationship between that broad concept of forest. We find some government forests are indeed improving, others are degrading. Same with private and community. But what we do find is when local users have at least some rights to harvest, and that may be to non-timber forest products, doesn't have to be timber, but some rights to harvest and some voice, they then monitor what's going on. And when the users monitor, that's when we find forest degradation being reduced and increased forest cover frequently. And this we're finding in a number of different studies. So this is not just one little study that we have. So I feel very strongly about what we've found here. So instead of one global remedy, I think we need to apply polycentric theory to develop complex multi-level political, economic, social systems to cope with complex multi-level ecological systems. We are recognizing from work on ecologically complex systems that you need a much different sorts of arrangements when you have pastures that are of one form near a forest of another, and you're trying to deal with them at one level. You need to break them up for some things. And we're finding repeatedly that local knowledge and local commitment are very important in terms of effective long-term policies. So I will make the statement, locals must be involved. Policies made at international and national level eventually require action at a local level. So you have a policy, a global policy, and it says we're going to reduce. Well, who's going to reduce? People in this audience. The question is, do you only do that because some government policy says you must? And do they monitor you? And are the taxes sufficient? And how is that actually done? And usually we've got to figure out, even if there's a global environment policy, eventually getting that implemented will have to be polycentric. So let's not just wait for the global. Let's see what all we can do in the meantime. And in the meantime, keep pushing international officials. I'm not saying give up. I'm just saying this is a risk. And we need to be reducing it. And so I will then turn it to questions if anyone has, and let it go from here.